The Boeing 737-800 shuddered at 37,000 feet, a mechanical tremor that shouldn't exist in modern aviation. In row 15, Lieutenant Colonel Vera Ghost Nakamura slept with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to rest wherever gravity would hold her. The burgundy blanket rose and fell with her breathing, her weathered hands folded across a dog-eared copy of Yeager's autobiography. She had been reading the same chapter about test piloting for 3 years now, not because she couldn't finish it, but because some stories deserve to be savored slowly. The flight attendant's voice cracked through the intercom with barely concealed panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a medical emergency in the cockpit. If there are any licensed pilots aboard, please ring your call button immediately." The words hung in the recycled air like smoke from a downed aircraft. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, the kind that ripple through a crowd when death suddenly announces its presence uninvited. Ghost's eyes opened before the announcement finished. 23 years of military service had trained her nervous system to recognize crisis in the frequency of human voices, in the subtle changes of engine harmonics, in the way silence gathered itself before striking. She didn't move immediately. Experience had taught her that the first person to volunteer was rarely the best person for the job. The flight attendant repeated the call, desperation bleeding through her professional training. "We urgently need anyone with aviation experience. Please, if you can help." Around Ghost, passengers craned their necks, searching for a hero who might emerge from the maze of blue upholstery and overhead compartments. A businessman in 12C raised his hand tentatively, then lowered it when his wife grabbed his wrist with white knuckles. Ghost pushed the call button. The soft chime seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly quiet cabin. She could feel the weight of 317 pairs of eyes settling on her small frame, taking in her civilian clothes, her graying temples, the way she moved with deliberate precision rather than urgency. The flight attendant approached with relief painted across her face until she got close enough to see what everyone else saw, a middle-aged woman who looked more like someone's aunt than their salvation. "Ma'am, do you have flight experience?" the attendant asked, hope warring with doubt in her voice. Ghost unbuckled her seatbelt with movements that spoke of muscle memory deeper than thought. "I might know a thing or two about flying," she said quietly, her voice carrying the understated confidence that only came from having danced with death at Mach 2 and lived to tell about it. The cockpit door had never seemed so far away. Behind her, passengers whispered prayers in 7 languages, creating a symphony of desperate hope. Ghost walked forward through the aluminum tube that had become a cathedral of collective fear, her footsteps marking time like a funeral march toward an appointment with physics that would either save them all or write their names in tomorrow's headlines. The flight attendant fumbled with keys, her hands shaking as the plane shuddered again, more violently this time. Inside the cockpit, Captain Martinez slumped unconscious over the controls, his breathing shallow and erratic. First Officer Kim sat rigid in her seat, sweat beading on her forehead as she stared at instruments that might as well have been hieroglyphs. "I've got maybe 60 hours total flight time," Kim whispered without looking back. "All in Cessnas. I don't know what half these switches do." The admission hung in the air like a confession at last rites. Ghost stepped forward and placed a steady hand on Kim's shoulder, feeling the young woman's terror transmitted through trembling muscle and bone. "Move to the jump seat," she said with quiet authority. "Tell me exactly what happened." Kim stammered through the sequence of events. Martinez had complained of chest pain, then sudden numbness in his left arm, then collapsed forward onto the yoke before she could react. The autopilot had disengaged when his weight pressed against the controls, sending the aircraft into a shallow dive that Kim had managed to arrest through pure instinct and terror. Ghost slid into the captain's seat, her hands finding the controls with the practiced ease of someone returning home after a long absence. The Boeing's cockpit was different from the F-16 Falcon she had flown for over a decade, but aircraft spoke a universal language of lift and thrust, of balance and control. Her fingers moved across switches and dials, checking fuel levels, hydraulic pressure, engine parameters, each reading telling part of a story she had learned to read like scripture. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," she spoke into the radio with calm precision. "United Flight 447, we have an incapacitated captain and are declaring a medical emergency, requesting priority handling and emergency services standing by." The response came immediately from Denver Center, the air traffic controller's voice professional but tight with concern. "United 447, roger your mayday. Say souls on board and fuel remaining." Ghost's eyes swept the instruments. 321 souls, approximately 4 hours fuel remaining. The numbers were stark mathematics of survival. They were still 2 hours out from Denver, flying over the Rocky Mountains where emergency landing options were as scarce as oxygen at altitude. Ghost's mind began calculating alternatives with the methodical precision that had earned her the call sign Ghost. Not because she was invisible, but because she had survived situations where others had simply vanished into the statistical void of military aviation casualties. She keyed the intercom, her voice reaching the passengers who sat suspended between earth and sky, their lives suddenly dependent on a woman most of them had dismissed as ordinary. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your pilot speaking." The words felt strange in her mouth after years of civilian life. "We're going to get through this together, but I need everyone to remain calm and follow all crew instructions. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for possible emergency procedures." Through the windscreen, the Colorado Rockies stretched endlessly below, their snow-capped peaks gleaming in the afternoon sun like monuments to forces beyond human control. Ghost had flown over these same mountains countless times in her F-16, but never with 320 other lives weighing on her decisions. The Boeing felt heavy in her hands, sluggish compared to the fighter jet's razor-sharp responsiveness, but she could sense its willingness to fly, its engineered desire to stay aloft despite the chaos in its cockpit. First Officer Kim watched from the jump seat, her initial terror slowly giving way to fascination as she observed Ghost work. There was something almost meditative in the older woman's movements, a rhythm that spoke of thousands of hours spent in conversation with machines designed to defy gravity. "Ma'am," Kim ventured quietly, "what kind of aircraft did you fly?" Ghost's hands never stopped moving across the controls as she answered. "Fast ones." The radio crackled with updates from Denver Center, vectors and altitudes that would guide them home through the controlled chaos of commercial airspace. Ghost acknowledged each transmission with the brevity that marked professional aviators, her responses clipped and precise. But beneath the professional exterior, her mind was racing through contingencies and backup plans, the mental gymnastics that separated good pilots from dead pilots in a profession that offered few second chances for mistakes. Behind them, the passengers had fallen into a strange quiet, the kind that settles over groups of strangers when they realize their individual fates have become irreversibly intertwined. Children sensed their parents' anxiety and grew still. Business people stopped checking phones and started checking seat belts. The elderly closed their eyes and reached for hands to hold, their weathered fingers intertwining with those of strangers who suddenly felt like family. Ghost trimmed the aircraft for level flight and allowed herself one quick glance back at the unconscious captain. Martinez was breathing, but his color was poor, his pulse already and weak beneath her fingertips. Whatever was happening to him needed medical attention that wouldn't be available until they reached the ground, assuming they reached the ground. The weight of his condition added another variable to an equation that was already balanced on the knife's edge of physics and skill. "Denver Center, United 447, she called. "I'll need you to coordinate with medical. We have one pilot down with what appears to be cardiac event. Also requesting that you clear a path. I'm going to need room to work." The controller's response was immediate and professional. "United 447, medical is standing by. Cleared direct Denver, descend and maintain flight level 350. All other traffic is being vectored clear of your route." The descent began with the subtle sensation of falling controlled by will and wing design. Ghost eased back on the throttles, watching engine parameters as the Boeing's thrust decreased and gravity began to assert its ancient claim. Through the windscreen, the horizon shifted slightly as the aircraft's nose dropped below level flight. She could feel the passengers behind her leaning forward in their seats as their bodies registered the change in vertical motion. 321 inner ears, suddenly paying attention to forces they usually ignored. First Officer Kim cleared her throat nervously. "Ma'am, I should probably ask, do you have experience with commercial aircraft?" It was a reasonable question, one that deserved an honest answer. Ghost's hands remained steady on the controls as she replied, "Not specifically, but I've got about 6,000 hours in military jets, and I've read every manual Boeing ever published for the 737. Sometimes insomnia has its benefits." The admission should have been terrifying, but something in Ghost's voice, a quality of unshakable competence that transcended specific aircraft types, made it sound almost reassuring. Kim nodded and settled back in the jump seat, watching as the altimeter wound slowly down from 37,000 feet toward the world below. Outside, wisps of cloud streamed past the windscreen like memories of flight itself, ephemeral and beautiful and utterly indifferent to human concerns. Ghost began configuring the aircraft for approach, extending flaps incrementally as airspeed decreased, feeling the Boeing transform from a high-speed transportation device into something more akin to a very large, very heavy glider. Each adjustment required delicate balance between multiple forces. Too much flap too early would create drag that would cost precious fuel. Too little would make the eventual landing approach dangerously fast. The mathematics of flight were unforgiving, but they were also predictable, and Ghost had learned long ago to trust physics over hope. The radio chattered with coordination between Denver approach control and various emergency services. Fire trucks were rolling, paramedics were standing by, and runway lights were being adjusted for maximum visibility even though it was still mid-afternoon. Ghost listened to the preparations with one part of her mind, while the other concentrated on the task of bringing her unwilling aircraft home safely. She had always been good at compartmentalization. It was a survival skill in military aviation, where emotional reactions could kill you faster than enemy fire. "United 447, you're 15 miles from the outer marker," came the call from approach control. "Runway 34 right is cleared and waiting. Wind is 270 at 8 knots, visibility unlimited." Ghost acknowledged the transmission and began her final approach checklist, calling out each item to First Officer Kim, who followed along in the printed manual with shaking fingers. Landing gear down and locked. Flaps 30. Engine parameters green. 321 people, depending on the next few minutes of flight. Through the windscreen, Denver International Airport appeared like a mirage of hope, its runways stretching across the Colorado prairie like concrete promises of safety. Ghost could see the emergency vehicles lined up alongside the runway, their red and blue lights painting abstract patterns against the beige terminal buildings. She had always found it oddly comforting that airports looked the same from altitude whether you approached them in peace or in crisis. The geometry of human organization imposed on landscape, rational and orderly, and utterly human in its defiance of chaos. The Boeing settled onto final approach with the patient grace of a large bird, accepting gravity's invitation to return to Earth. Ghost's hands made minute corrections to heading and glide path, each adjustment measured in degrees and feet, the accumulated precision that separated good landings from emergency landings from disasters. Behind her, she could hear passengers shifting in their seats, seatbelt buckles clicking, nervous coughs and whispered prayers combining into the soundtrack of collective anxiety. 500 feet, Kim called out, reading the radio altimeter as Ghost had instructed. The ground rushed up to meet them with increasing urgency, details resolving from abstract landscape into specific reality. Grass, concrete, the threshold markers that designated the beginning of runway 34 right. Ghost pulled the throttles to idle and eased back on the yoke, beginning the delicate dance of energy management that would transition 300,000 pounds of aluminum and human hopes from flight to ground operations. The main landing gear touched the runway with barely a tremor, Ghost's timing and touch making the Boeing's arrival on Earth feel as natural as a leaf settling onto still water. The nose gear followed a moment later, and suddenly they were no longer flying. They were taxiing, rolling down the center line of runway 34 right toward the emergency vehicles that had been waiting with mechanical patience for their arrival. Ghost applied brakes gradually, letting the aircraft's momentum bleed away in controlled increments rather than sudden stops that might injure passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Denver," she announced over the intercom, her voice carrying a note of dry humor that made several passengers laugh despite everything they had just experienced. "Please remain seated until we reach the gate and emergency personnel have had a chance to check on our captain." Through the windscreen, she could see paramedics running toward the aircraft, their equipment reflecting the late afternoon sunlight like instruments of hope made manifest. As the Boeing came to a complete stop, Ghost finally allowed her shoulders to relax, her hands releasing their grip on controls that had become extensions of her own nervous system for the past 2 hours. Behind her, passengers began applauding, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm as the reality of their survival settled into minds that had been preparing for very different outcomes. First Officer Kim reached over and placed her hand on Ghost's shoulder, her voice barely audible over the clapping. "Ma'am, that was incredible flying." Ghost unbuckled her harness and stood up, her legs surprisingly steady after the adrenaline roller coaster of emergency flight operations. "Just another day at the office," she said, but her voice carried the slight tremor that came with the release of carefully controlled fear. Through the windscreen, she could see the paramedics boarding the aircraft, their professional urgency focused entirely on Captain Martinez, who was beginning to stir as consciousness slowly returned. The passengers filed off the aircraft with the strange bonding that occurs between strangers who have shared mortal peril and emerged intact. Many stopped to thank Ghost as they passed the cockpit, their words inadequate to express gratitude for life itself, but their eyes saying everything that language could not contain. She accepted their thanks with the quiet dignity of someone who had simply done what training and experience had prepared her to do, nothing more and nothing less than professional competence applied under pressure. Airport operations personnel appeared with clipboards and forms, the bureaucratic machinery that processed unusual events into statistical data and insurance reports. Ghost answered their questions with the same precision she had applied to flying the aircraft, each detail recorded and filed away in archives where extraordinary events became ordinary paperwork. She gave them her name, her contact information, her pilot certificate numbers from a military career that most of them could barely comprehend. As the last passenger left the aircraft, Ghost gathered her belongings from row 15, the dog-eared Yeager biography, her reading glasses, the boarding pass that had promised routine transportation between 2 points in space and time. The flight attendant who had first approached her in the cabin appeared at the cockpit door, tears streaming down her cheeks, her professional composure finally giving way to the emotional release that crisis situations demand once safety has been restored. "I don't know how to thank you," the attendant whispered. Ghost looked up from packing her small bag, her gray eyes holding the kind of weariness that comes not from exhaustion, but from the weight of responsibility carried and discharged. "Just doing my job," she said softly. "Or at least, the job I used to do." She paused, looking out at the empty passenger cabin where 321 people had trusted her with their lives based on nothing more than her willingness to step forward, when stepping forward was required. The paramedics emerged from the cockpit with Captain Martinez on a stretcher, his color improved, his breathing more regular. He would recover, the lead paramedic told Ghost, a mild heart attack, treatable and survivable, the kind of medical emergency that happened to middle-aged pilots with more frequency than the airlines liked to publicize. Martinez caught her eye as they wheeled him past, managed a weak smile, and a thumbs-up that spoke volumes about the brotherhood of aviators who understood that every flight was a small victory over the forces that wanted to keep human beings firmly planted on the ground. Ghost walked through the empty aircraft one last time, her footsteps echoing in the aluminum tube that had briefly become her responsibility and her domain. The passenger cabin looked different now, not just empty, but somehow sacred, like a church after the congregation has departed, but before the candles have been extinguished. She could feel the weight of what had happened here, the intersection of training and crisis that had transformed an ordinary commercial flight into something that would be remembered and retold, analyzed and celebrated. Outside, the Colorado sun was setting behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Ghost of countless sunsets viewed from fighter jet cockpits at altitudes where the curvature of the earth became visible, and the infinite silence of space pressed against aircraft canopies like a presence both terrifying and beautiful. She had always loved flying at dusk, those moments when day surrendered to night and the world below sparkled with the lights of human civilization, refusing to acknowledge darkness. The airport shuttle arrived to take her to the main terminal, driven by a young man who recognized her from the news reports that were already beginning to circulate about Flight 447's emergency landing. "Ma'am, are you the pilot who saved all those people?" he asked as she settled into the passenger seat. Ghost looked out the window at the aircraft she had just left, now surrounded by maintenance personnel and investigators, who would spend the next several hours documenting every detail of what had occurred at 37,000 feet above the Colorado Rockies. "I'm just someone who was in the right place at the right time," she replied, but even as she said it, she knew that wasn't entirely true. She had been in that particular seat on that particular flight, because of choices she had made decades earlier, career decisions that had led her through Air Force flight training and fighter assignments, and test pilot school, and eventually to a retirement that had never quite felt like retirement, because pilots never really stopped being pilots. They just stopped getting paid to practice the ancient art of controlled flight. The shuttle dropped her at the main terminal, where news crews were already setting up cameras and reporters were interviewing passengers who spoke in excited, grateful tones about the woman who had appeared from nowhere to save their lives. Ghost slipped through the crowd unnoticed, her practiced ability to blend into civilian populations serving her well as she made her way toward the airline counter to arrange new travel to her original destination, a wedding in Seattle where she was supposed to give away her niece. But as she stood in line at the ticket counter, Ghost found herself thinking not about wedding plans or future flights, but about the moment when she had first stepped into Flight 447's cockpit and felt the familiar embrace of aircraft controls designed by engineers who understood that human beings were meant to fly, even if evolution had forgotten to give them wings. For 2 hours, she had been completely herself again, not a retired officer, not someone's aunt, not a middle-aged woman trying to figure out what came after military service, but simply and purely a pilot doing what pilots do. The ticket agent looked up expectantly, ready to help her navigate the complexities of rebooking after an emergency landing, but Ghost found herself hesitating. Through the terminal windows, she could see aircraft taking off and landing in the steady rhythm that made modern aviation possible, each departure and arrival representing someone's journey from one point in their life to another. She thought about Captain Martinez, who would recover and fly again, and First Officer Kim, who had learned today what real crisis looked like and how professional aviators responded to it. "Ma'am, how can I help you?" the agent asked again, and Ghost realized that she was smiling, the first genuine smile she had felt in months. "Actually," she said, reaching into her bag for her phone, "I think I need to make a call first." She stepped away from the counter and dialed a number she had memorized but never used, the recruitment line for a major airline that had been sending her letters for years, offering positions for experienced military pilots willing to transition to commercial aviation. The phone rang twice before someone answered. "Good evening. This is United Airlines pilot recruitment. How may I help you?" Ghost looked out at the aircraft moving across the tarmac, their navigation lights blinking in patterns that spoke of destinations and purposes and the endless human desire to be somewhere other than where they were. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Vera Nakamura, retired Air Force. I understand you might have an opening for someone with my background." The conversation that followed would change the trajectory of her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine, leading to training programs and check rides, and eventually to her own captain's wings with a major airline. But in that moment, standing in Denver International Airport with the Colorado mountains visible through floor-to-ceiling windows, Ghost felt something she hadn't experienced since her retirement ceremony. The certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her niece in Seattle. "Aunt Vera saw the news about your flight. Are you okay? The wedding can wait, just get here when you can." Ghost typed back quickly. "I'm fine. Save me some cake. I might be a little late, looks like I'm going back to work." She hit send and looked up at the departure board, watching flights cycle through destinations that suddenly seemed less like obligations and more like possibilities. Outside, another aircraft lifted off from runway 34 right, its lights disappearing into the gathering darkness of the Colorado evening. Ghost watched it go, remembering the feeling of that moment when lift overcame weight and an aircraft transitioned from earthbound machine to instrument of human aspiration. Tomorrow she would call her niece with the full story, would explain how sometimes life required you to be ready for opportunities disguised as emergencies, how the skills you thought you had left behind had ways of calling you back when they were needed most. She walked toward the departure gates, already thinking about flight schedules and training requirements and the bureaucratic machinery that would need to process her return to commercial aviation. Behind her, the gates for Flight 447 were being cleaned and prepared for the next group of passengers who would trust their lives to aircraft and pilots and the controlled miracle that made human flight possible. Ghost paused at the window one more time, watching the lights of Denver spread below like stars brought down to Earth, and whispered a quiet thank you to whatever forces had put her in row 15, when row 15 was exactly where she needed to be.